Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening in to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by Reverend Dr. Paula Stone Williams. Hello.
Good to see you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your time and patience today, and appreciate you being on the pod.
Sure, my pleasure.
So, Paula has a long history of service to the church. For 35 years, she led a large New York-based church planting ministry. She also served as a megachurch teaching pastor, magazine editor-at-large, seminary instructor, and pastoral counselor. She's a doctor of ministry and pastoral care and serves as a pastoral counselor and CEO for RLT Pathways, a Colorado-based counseling nonprofit. She's been a TEDx and TED speaker, and she travels around speaking a lot. And right now she's serving as one of the co-pastors and a founding pastor of Left Hand Church in, what are y'all? Longmont, Colorado, right?
Longmont. Yep.
Longmont. Awesome. Well, Paula, for our listeners who don't know you well, share some of your story if you don't mind.
Sure. I was always been a bit of a Renaissance person. As you talk about the things that I'm doing, it's like, wow, she's busy. But I've always been kind of that person. So yes, I did run on what became a very large, one of the nation's largest church planting organizations. I was on the preaching team of two different mega churches, one here in Colorado, one in the Philadelphia area.
Mm-hmm.
I was the editor-at-large of a national religious magazine. I was actually the host of a national quasi-religious television show that was on in 70 markets around the United States on PAX TV. It did all of PAX TV's programming in the middle of the night. I also was the head writer for that, and then also worked as an adoption caseworker for about 25 years. And then ended up getting my master's and doctorate in pastoral counseling. So I also have had a private counseling practice. But I knew from the time I was 3 or 4 years of age, I was transgender and just was hoping I could get through life without transitioning. Finally came to the realization that wasn't going to happen. And so I came out and promptly lost every single one of my jobs.
Yeah.
Of course, in all 50 states, you can't be fired for being transgender, but in all 50, you can be fired if you work for a religious corporation. So everybody I worked for, with one exception, was a religious corporation.
Yeah.
That exception was the magazine, and they pulled my column immediately. But they had to keep me employed until my contract ran out, which was 8 more months. They didn't really have me do anything in that time frame. So yeah, I pretty much lost all of it, and then just kind of had to build it all back from scratch, which was not all that easy. I was pretty frustrated that I had really lost my denomination. I was one of the national leaders in the independent Christian churches and Churches of Christ, which is a denomination of about 6,000 churches, a lot of mega churches, one of the leaders in national church planting.
Yeah.
Actually runs the Exponential Conference. And I was one of our, I don't know, probably 25 or 50 national leaders. And just, I was totally turned out from that world. I knew thousands of people in that denomination. And to date, I've been contacted in a nice way by about 60 of them.
Wow.
And I've met, I think, 20. I think we're up to about 20. And I think it's 6 more than once. So not exactly a warm reception there.
Yeah.
And then one of my friends from Lifebridge Church, where I used to preach in Longmont, one of the other staff members there introduced me to Mark Ted at Highlands Church in Denver. From Mark, I got to know the guys at Denver Community Church, and so joined the preaching team at Highlands, and for a while also on the preaching team at Denver Community Church. Both those churches joined together with Forefront Church in New York, which is my son's church, to start Left Hand, not quite 3 years ago. So about 3 years ago, I did my first TED Talk that was done at TEDx Mile High, and it's had 4 million views.
Wow.
So that's kind of what catapulted me into the stratosphere of the TED world. I've done another TEDx Mile High talk. I'm on their curation team. I've been a speaker's ambassador for TED. I've spoken for TED. I spoke at the TED Summit, which is an every 3-year event last year. From that, I've done a bunch of TV shows and speak at corporations all over the world. So last week I talked to Pinterest, and the week before that, MasterCard, and do a lot of international speaking as well. So I spoke for Eli Lilly, one of their spin-off companies, a couple of weeks ago at 6 a.m. and then again at 1 p.m. because they were a worldwide company.
Yeah.
And then at 11:30 that night, I did another event for a company in Mumbai, India. It was, I believe, noon the
Wow.
next day for them when I did that. So I'm doing a lot of that.
I'm guessing you're doing
as
it
well
all
as
virtually then.
It's wonderful. I have a speakers agency in New York City that books all my stuff for me, and they've been able to get my regular in-person speaking rates. So I'm not
Wow.
complaining about that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, share, if you would, a little with our listeners what it meant in the past for you to be a Christian, and if anything's different now, what that looks like.
I think my faith is probably far more peaceful to me now. I grew up in the evangelical world and felt like I could change it from within. And I don't think I realized that that's actually not possible. I would not say it's possible to change it from within at this point. And so for a lot of years, probably 20 years, my last 20 years working in that world, my theology was in one place and my denomination was in another.
Yeah.
So for me to be freed from that was actually initially frustrating because I found that the mainline Protestant churches that I was attending, they were frightened by my evangelical background, particularly by the fact that I had been an evangelical megachurch pastor and that I had taught at evangelical seminaries. And so they were not real eager to have me. Plus, I actually prefer evangelical methodology. I like the music. I like the non-liturgical nature of it. I like the non-denominational nature of it. Like my former denomination was not technically a denomination. It was a collection of 6,000 churches.
Right.
And so the independent church movement,
Yeah.
that to me appealed more. So once I found Highlands Church and Denver Community Church, it's like, now I have found my home. Because these are places that have mainline theology, more liberal theology, but have the methodology that I prefer.
Yeah. Now, for our listeners, Paula and I come from, I guess, I always say, Paula, we're kind of ecclesiological cousins, or at least we come from those roots.
It's cousins or siblings.
Siblings, maybe, yeah.
There are 3 branches to what was been known as the Restoration Movement. Other people call it the Stone Campbell Movement. And that's based on Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, the 2 early leaders in the 19th century. And you have 3 different branches that have come out of that. You have the independent Christian churches, you have the non-instrumental churches of Christ. Both of those have about 2 million members each. And then you have the Disciples of Christ, which is your denomination.
Yep, that's correct.
And so all 3 from the same roots. I'm deeply embedded in that. I actually, Barton W. Stone is my great-great-great-grandfather.
Yeah,
so
I'd heard that.
My roots go way, way back.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I want to come back. I have a question I want to ask you, but I'll come back to that from hearing your background. But what spiritual practices have you developed or might you recommend to others?
When it comes to spiritual disciplines, I remember working on my doctorate and taking a required course in spiritual disciplines. And I said at the beginning to the 2 professors who are also friends of mine, I said, you're going to find that I'm rather incorrigible when it comes to traditional spiritual practice. I just haven't found any of the practices that work for me, not fasting, not contemplative prayer, not, and they're like, shoot, we're going to convert you. You'll be fine. You'll love it. And when I was all done, they're like, no, this stuff doesn't really work for you, does it? For me, probably the most valuable thing I've ever done was I was a part of a Roman Catholic study group for 25 years in New York that met every week. And the rector of the Long Island Seminary, Immaculate Conception Seminary, had a PhD from Louvain in philosophy. So he really was my spiritual mentor for 25 years. That group for me was where my real spiritual strength developed. And outside of that, I just enjoy the weekly worship services of whatever church I'm a part of. And of course, at this point, I'm leading
Yeah.
worship at a church.
You spend quite a bit outdoors. I'm curious. I know I've talked to others who really connect the outdoors to their spirituality. Has it been the same for you?
My definition of God is probably what historically has been known as general revelation. I say all the time in our church that we have just three responsibilities. First of all, to love the God who burst on the scene 14 billion years ago in all of God's complexity, mystery, ever expansiveness, rooted in relationship and grounded in love. I use the same language every single time, which is, in fact, I think, a definition of the Big Bang and the discoveries of quantum physics, that the ultimate building blocks of the universe are not made of matter, but are made of relationships, pattern of relationships between non-material entities. So when I think of God, I think of that. I think of the ultimate reality being relationship. And I think of the Trinity, and I think of God as relationship. And of course, if the only ultimate reality is relationships, as quantum physics seems to indicate, then the greatest force in the world is love. So when I talk about loving God, that's the God I talk about loving. And then the person of Jesus and the Spirit. And then we feel like our second responsibility as a church is to love our neighbor, which is every human being with whom we come in contact. And our third is to love ourselves. And you can't do the other two if you can't love yourself. So that kind of is the foundation of our
pretty good
our what we teach at Left Hand Church.
I'm curious. Are you familiar with the work of I don't know if I say her name right, Ilia Delio?
No, I'm not.
She's a Catholic theologian, but comes from a science background, and she writes about. You said it better than I could. Quantum physics and all that.
No, most of my work in that area came through John Polkinghorne, who was
interesting.
A British, actually was a member of Parliament at one point, astrophysicist who actually was on the team that coined the term quantum physics and discovered chaos theory.
Interesting.
And also is an Anglican cleric, so he's also an Anglican priest. So a lot of his work, particularly I think his book Quarks, Chaos, and Christianity, was seminal for me, as was Owen Gingrich's book. He's an astrophysicist at Harvard. His book God's Universe were both really helpful to me in that area.
I'll have to check those out. Well, let's shift gears here. Let's talk about. I thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk to you about kind of your experience in church planning, like what you've done for so much of your career, and like you said, what you're doing now. So, what I kind of want to just hear, I mean, I imagine there's so much to choose from, but what is there some what would you say is a big takeaway from your lifetime of experience in church planting?
I do. I'm a believer in church planting. I'm a believer in the church. If you take a look at the history of our species, we did not grow beyond the level of blood kin to become a tribal species until fairly recently, really, in our history as a species. And what brought us together beyond the level of blood kin was actually not what one would think, which was the need for protection and safety. What brought us together beyond the level of blood kin as a species was the search for meaning. So think Stonehenge or burial mounds in North America. The search for meaning brought us together, and that actually is when our evolution as a species sped up exponentially. It's where we actually became the humans we are today. And so baked into our very species is this need to explain the basic meaning of life. And to me, that ultimately is why I believe in religious institutions. We're also a tribal species. Edward O. Wilson is a sociobiologist who taught at Harvard and MIT and won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. One was for identifying that the key social unit of the species is the tribe. And then the other was identifying the 9 eusocial species, which are species that not only have what Richard Dawkins would call a selfish gene, but also have a tribal gene. And he says one of the unfortunate realities is that of the 9 eusocial species, we're the only one who's evolved to believe that an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. So where no enemy exists, we create one.
Yeah.
So I think religion is the good news and the bad news. If you take a look at the 3 desert religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they began as desert religions, and therefore they began as religions of scarcity. That's completely understandable. But in their fundamentalist forms, they remain religions of scarcity. And in their fundamentalist forms, they also create enemies that don't exist. And right now, those 2 enemies are abortion and LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting that they have chosen 2 subjects that cost their all-male leadership absolutely nothing to hold those positions. You know, only 3% of them are gay.
Not a lot.
And none of them are having abortions.
Yeah.
So, it's just interesting that they've chosen 2 social positions, 2 enemies, if you will, that cost them absolutely nothing. But for instance, if they chose poverty as their main social concern, that would cost them something. Yeah.
Well, let me ask about then. What do you see as the difference between planting a conservative-leaning church and a progressive-leaning church? Like, whether it's methodology, whether it's obviously theology, broader philosophy, what would you say is the difference?
I think methodologically, I believe that starting a church with the methods that the evangelical world discovered in starting really with the work of the Charles Fuller Institute and Pete Wagner's work, and then carried on through Carl George's work. And early on, actually, Rick Warren at Saddleback was very involved in the church planting world. They turned church planting into a science, and that's when I first became involved in it. And the organization I directed, the Orchard Group, we went from starting churches that averaged 50 at 5 years of age and topped out at 75 people to churches that averaged often 500 at 5 years of age and were running 1,000 by year 10. We have a church in this area we started where that kind of was their story. Discovery Church in Broomfield followed that trajectory. And that was having turned it into a science where you basically look at the market, and decide what causes people to go to church and what causes them to come back. And I think that actually is true regardless of your theology. People go to church because a friend invited them. 72% of people go to church because a friend invited them. 76% of them come back because they liked the pastor and the message the pastor gave. So they identified with the spiritual journey of the person speaking. And then the majority of the rest came back because they like the music. They like the style of the worship. So if we take a look, and I'm going to be really crass at this point, what causes Americans to go to a church is a friend inviting them. What causes them to go back is they like the show. They like the sermon they heard with a dynamic, exciting speaker, and they like the music they heard. And interestingly, the biggest reasons they don't come back are the quality of the facility and the quality of the children's programming.
I believe
and it's actually mostly mom who decides if we're coming back. That's kind of holds true. So that has nothing to do with theology. Now, having said that, I think there is a difference in the ability of churches once established to grow rapidly that is theological. We're seeing 3 major shifts, and Brian McLaren writes about these in The Great Spiritual Divide. 3 major shifts taking place. Richard Rohr talks about it in Divine Dance too. A shift from orthodoxy to orthopraxy, a shift from right belief to right practice, from believing the right things to loving well, a shift from the church existing for its own self-protection to the church existing for the common good.
Yeah.
And the third is, I think, significant to church planting, a shift from God as the eternal threatener to God as the ultimate loving and suffering participant,
Yeah.
the one who came to show solidarity with us in our suffering. So if you remove the threat of the God who actually really, really, really wants to send you to hell because he really kind of can't stand you
Yeah.
as you are, unless you repent and become a Christian, that actually causes more people to go to church because they're driven to go by fear.
Yeah.
So they're afraid that once they die, that God's going to send them to hell unless they go to church regularly. So it's interesting, evangelicals and fundamentalists who do believe that God will in fact send them to hell if they don't behave properly, they actually attend church more often. They'll attend 3 weeks out of 4,
Yeah.
as opposed to 1 out of 3. And they will give more income. They'll give 10% of their income as opposed to 2.8% of their income that the rest of us give.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you take away that fear factor, and that's where you don't see churches like Highlands or Denver Community Church or Left Hand or any of the mainline denominations, new churches grow as rapidly because they don't
They don't.
motivate through fear, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. I feel like this kind of relates to the statement you said earlier about some of the mainline Protestant denominations being kind of scared off by your evangelical roots.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kind of curious about that. What do you think it is about? I mean, maybe say for our listeners, I feel like I have a hunch, but I'm curious to hear your response. What do you think that's about?
I used to teach a doctoral course in a doctor of ministry program, Current Trends in American Religion. And, I believe the unfortunate, sobering statistic is that most of the mainline denominations, if they continued their current patterns,
Yeah, it's
which
not
they
good.
actually will not, there will be a point at which they aren't losing the number of people they're losing now.
Yeah.
But if you take just the United Church of Christ, for instance, at their current levels of loss, that denomination won't exist in 25 years.
Yeah.
Most of the mainline Protestant denominations won't exist in 25 years. The PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the USA, is in pretty good shape. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is in pretty good shape. But you get the United Church of Christ,
Disciples
the
aren't in
Disciples of
great
Christ,
shape.
your denomination,
Yeah.
not in great shape.
No.
And most of those churches are people 70 and over in age. And I think, I believe that there is an inappropriate dislike of worship styles that are non-liturgical. And that the leadership of those denominations, first of all, those denominations are well endowed. They have a lot of buildings, and so the monies are going to be around for a long time, and so the clergy are going to keep getting paid for a long time.
Yeah.
And so they don't have that same
Not
urgency
motivated.
that you and I have as church planters
Yep.
To get it done now. But those churches, a lot of them just don't see the relevance of developing a worship style that is popular. And so the fact that I said a few minutes ago that I think people come back because they like the show, they'd be like, see, exactly.
Right.
And my point to that would be, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Actually, some of the greatest worship moments in my life have been in the middle of Broadway shows.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to always take people to see Les Miserables in New York when I lived there. And I think every single time I went, it was a worship experience. There's nothing wrong with teaching people and entertaining them at the same time. And I believe we do that at Left Hand Church. And interestingly, during COVID, we've got 1,600 viewers a week from all over the world. And I think it's because of John and my preaching. And I think it's because of Heather-Lynn's music.
Yeah.
I believe that I don't understand why the mainline churches are opposed to that kind of methodology. You
Yeah.
don't have to sell your theological soul
Yeah.
to shift your methodology. And that would be my one complaint. There are exceptions. I think of a church in Asheville, North Carolina, UCC Church, where Sarah Wilcox pastors. It's a vibrant, new, exciting church that is, in fact, liturgical in its worship style. But those are the exception, not the rule.
Yeah. I have this observation. I'm curious what your thoughts on it are, Paula. Like, it seems to me like when people think church, like if you think your average kind of like suburbanite or really even young, like 20-something city dweller, like when they think church, they think like mega church worship style.
Right.
So
Yeah.
trying to get someone like that to visit like a high liturgical church, to me, seems next to impossible. Am I wrong?
Well, I think you'll see a lot of younger evangelicals or post-evangelicals
Sure.
who are intellectuals who
Yeah.
actually really like the Episcopal Church. So
Yeah.
I was one of my friends is in the New Begin School right now, and
Okay. Yeah.
so I watched her with her as Pete Enns, the theologian who's written popularly and marvelously about the Bible, as he talked about how he just can't abide by evangelical churches any longer, and that he goes to an Episcopal church. But those are the kinds of folks who tend to go to Episcopal churches are the more intellectually inclined among the younger generation, although Enns is a boomer. But if you look at the Gen X or the millennials.
Certainly Sarah or Rachel Hall Evans would be a prominent example, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you take a look at, Jim Chafee's done an amazing job with the Evolving Faith Conference. And if you take a look at the people that Jim knows to appeal to, of course, he's comes out of the evangelical background and was a music producer in Nashville. But he has caught, where the market's moving, that there is, in fact, a sizable market for an unchurched population that want to explore spirituality together, but not in typical liturgical fashion.
Yeah.
And so, my son's church, Forefront Church in New York, is a church of about 400 people that's 5 years old. And I swear half of Broadway goes to his church, and their music is just amazing.
Yeah.
In fact, their worship pastor used to play Fontaine on Broadway.
Wow.
And it's, they just have all these 20-somethings flocking into their church because it is, in fact, a church that that has what I would unashamedly call a good show.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, even if we think like historically, I think of like these big mainline Protestant cathedrals. And I got to imagine like back in the day, like they had a pretty good choir that was, I mean, they certainly wouldn't call it a show, but it was, I mean, if you think about like these big buildings, like they were incredible pieces, so many of them were incredible pieces of architecture meant to, I imagine, draw people in.
Yeah, when I, one comes to mind right away that I could, in fact, attend. Not now, just because of the politics that have kind of made a mess of the place. But Riverside Church in New York was built with Rockefeller money.
Yeah.
And they've rather misogynistically treated their most recent pastor. They've finally caused her to just say, "I'm out of here."
Not super well, yeah.
Yeah, it was just pretty ugly. But they have an amazing choir and liturgical worship, and a couple thousand people that attend or were attending. And yeah, that's a place I could have gone. I'll be preaching in a couple of weeks for Middle Collegiate Church in New York, where Jackie Lewis is.
Yeah.
And I preached for them last November as well. And they are, they're mainline RCA. Well, they're a collegiate church, which predates the RCA. And, full building and an amazing choir. A little bit more liturgical, maybe kind of halfway in between the two.
Yeah.
And but they also appeal to both of those churches would appeal to a more intellectual kind of population.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm finishing up a memoir for Simon and Schuster, and my editor, I was struggling through some stuff a few weeks ago, and the editor said, "Well, my pastor was saying something in a sermon," and she started talking about what the sermon was, and I said, "Wait a minute, is that Jackie?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Oh my goodness, I go there." I said, obviously you weren't there when I preached last year. You would
Yeah.
have remembered it, once I started working with you on my book. But those are the kinds of folks, an editor for Simon and
Yeah.
Schuster,
Yeah.
that you see at those churches, and that's a little bit more difficult to create in a Denver, Colorado, than it
Yeah.
is in a Manhattan, New York. It's even harder to
Yeah.
create in Brooklyn
Yeah.
than in Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. I listened to. I mean, I've been listening to some of the influential evangelical church planting voices over the summer. Stetzer, um, Newhoff. Those kind of folks. And it's been interesting hearing them how they talk about how they think COVID will affect church planting. And I'm curious your thoughts too. Like, I know a lot of evangelicals kind of plowing full speed ahead, trying to do an online launch or something. Like, how do you think, maybe not just for evangelicals, but for progressive kind of leaning, like, I guess it's a broad question, but how do you see like this COVID like affecting church and the future of the church, especially as new efforts?
Yeah, I probably should preface my comments by saying that I transitioned a little over 6 years ago and haven't been as involved in the church planting world. Frankly, that world that I used to be involved in wouldn't let me come back in.
Mm-hmm.
But when I take a look at even the first 15 years of this century, we saw a lot of new churches play around with video,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty much all of them come to the conclusion that video could not be a primary way of doing church, that it could be secondary, but it couldn't be primary, that
Hmm.
people needed to gather.
Yeah.
And so, like Life Church probably taught that as much as anybody else. And now I think all of us are realizing that once we do get back, it's just like all of my corporate speaking I've been doing recently. I would imagine once COVID's over, I'm going to be doing maybe half of that live, and about half of that's going to stay
Mm-hmm.
virtual, which is fine by me. I don't mind speaking to 4,000 people and never leaving my living room.
Yeah.
But I believe for the church, it's going to be the same. Like, one of the things that we're talking about on the left hand is a realization that once we do have people come back in, we have got to stay camera focused.
Yeah.
That our pastor's got to be looking into the camera as much as she's looking into the audience,
Yeah.
and that our background has got to be tight and good as it is now. I think
Yeah.
we have for a brand new church, I think I'm actually very pleased with the product, if you will, that we put out on the weekends, and I think we have such a large viewership because it is visually pleasing. It's
Yeah.
pleasing to the ear. It's we're stuck at 720p as everybody is who's on Facebook as a platform,
Yeah.
but we're shooting in 1080.
Mm-hmm.
And have the capacity to shoot in 4K, which we'll be thinking about these things from
Yeah.
now on out.
Yeah.
Even once we're live, we actually have we call our small groups branches, and we actually have probably our most vibrant branch right now is our virtual branch, which
Yeah.
has people from all over the world and is led by someone in Dunedin, New Zealand.
Wow.
So that I believe is going to be a part of the future. But again, the church, when the day is done, is incarnational.
Yeah.
It's flesh. The church is
Yeah.
flesh. And Christianity is flesh. It's fleshly.
Yeah.
So to think that Christianity can succeed via disembodied images
Mm.
is, I think, maybe chipping away at its core.
Yeah, I can't disagree at all. I can't disagree at all. Well,
I know I miss the face to face with our
yeah.
people
I,
a lot.
I appreciate what you say about looking at the camera. I know I've been watching some pastors on Facebook, and it's just kind of like a awkward side angle the whole time. And I'm just like, just look at the camera, like, because it's kind of like,
Yeah,
are
I
you
worked in
preaching to somebody, or are you
yeah,
just look at the
I worked in
camera?
television for 18 years, so
Yeah.
it's pretty easy for me to stare right into a camera and read a
Lexi,
teleprompter,
please be quiet.
which we don't have. But I memorize all my sermons, so it's easy
Yeah.
for me to never
Yeah.
take my eyes off the camera.
Well, I want to ask you one more question that's kind of related, a little bit off topic, but I'm curious about. And I've seen this, and I'll state my bias here. Someone coming from mainline Protestantism, which is super focused on theological education and higher education at that seminary and such. I see it a lot in the evangelical church planning world, especially. A lot of folks who come from a business background or communications background, but there's not a lot of theological education. So I'd kind of ask the opposite question of what I asked when I had a seminary professor on here recently. I asked her, "Tell me why theological education still matters. Why should we keep investing in it?" So I'd kind of ask you the inverse of that. Like, what would you say? Does theological education matter for ministry? I guess.
I believe it matters for the church. I find that unfortunately, seminary is pretty effective at teaching people theology and teaching them nothing about entrepreneurial leadership
You're not
or
wrong.
how to grow something from
You're
scratch,
not
how to
wrong.
relate to people. And so when we started Left Hand, we had I was the only trained theologian with
Hmm.
2 master's degrees and a
Yeah.
doctoral degree. And I remain the only trained theologian. Now, John Gaddis, our other preaching pastor, is an attorney, and John is very well educated theologically, but it's self-education, which I think is fine. My son, the same way, he's lead pastor of the church in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
Jonathan's actually one of the finest theologians I know, and he studied under the tutelage of a PhD in New Testament from Yale.
Oh
Was
wow.
his spiritual director for Reverend Jared Witt, and so that actually is what was Jonathan's major theological
Can you
formation,
guys be
and
a little
he reads
quieter?
voraciously, as do I. But I do think it's important to have a theologian on staff.
Hmm.
I think
I
that at our church, um, I you see a lot of these evangelical churches that take hard and fast positions
hmm.
that are hermeneutically ridiculous
Yeah.
and even exegetically suspect
Yeah.
because they've never studied the original languages. They
Yeah.
don't really even know how the canon of scripture was formed.
Yeah.
And so I think that having a pastor who's got that background is pretty critical.
You make such a good point, even initially about seminary not preparing you entrepreneurially or whatever.
Right.
I'm working on an MBA right now for that reason. And I'm taking a class in nonprofit management right now, and I'm just thinking like a seminary, we should have like one class in like how to run a board.
I mean, absolutely. I took one of my master's degrees is in practical ministries.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was 36 hours of all of that stuff. And I just loved doing it.
Yeah.
And I used to teach a lot in that same program. I taught church planting in it. And when we taught church planting, it was the very practical side of it.
Yeah.
And the scores that I would get from students would be in the stratosphere. And,
Mm.
I'd like to think it was because I was a great professor. But I
Yeah.
think the truth is mostly it's because I was covering information
Yeah.
that they found to be relevant that they simply weren't getting in their theology courses.
Well, I don't know if you've heard this analogy, but one of the things I've heard a lot is, going to seminary, getting an MDiv is like training to be a chef and then running a restaurant. Like you, as a chef, you know how to cook, but running a restaurant's a whole another animal. And I
Exactly.
think, I think that's one of the. I'm half tempted to like talk to my seminary and be like, hey, can I teach a class in like how to run a board or stuff? Because I know I could have used that class.
It's that's the kind of practical stuff that I created. For instance, I wrote a chapter in a book on church planting on the development of your board,
Oh.
and I said you generally want to start with an external board of
Mm-hmm.
6 people and internal of just the lead pastor. So you had 7 total.
Yeah.
And then at the end of year 1, you lost 2 of your external people, and the external people were always either from the denomination or from supporting churches, financially supporting churches. And then at the end of year 1, you bring 2 people from the local church on, 2 external go off. The end of year 2, 2 more come on, 2 more go off. The end of year 3, 2 more come on, 2 more go off. And so by the end of year 3, you have a totally internal board of 7 people, and their terms are staggered so that those who came on year 1 will serve 3 years before they take a year off. And we would always actually allow, at the Orchard Group, we would allow board members to function to have 2 successive 3-year terms before they had to take a year off, and then they had to take a year off. And the only staff person ever on the board was the lead pastor. And that, we found no reason to change that in 30 years of church planting. It just worked. The only thing you would do would be increase the size of the board, always keeping it an odd number. And we would increase the size of it from 7 to 9 to 11. Rarely did we ever go larger than 11. And always would have the lead pastor as one of the voting members, never as chair. And every single meeting, you would have an executive session where the lead pastor is out of the meeting, whether there were problems or not, because there's no way to start doing that if you haven't done it from the beginning. It's simple board stuff. It's Carver policy governance. And
I think that's
we used it all the time.
I think it's a great practice of that, starting with external and slowly transitioning. Because in my experience, like, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, when you start a new church, you kind of get the church hoppers and disgruntled people who see your new church as an opportunity to kind of like set their agenda. And at least in my experience, like for something new, it's so important to kind of stay true to that original mission, and that kind of external board can help you kind of slowly hold on to that and slowly transition.
Yeah, there's even a name for it. It's called the Clash of the Dream. And we talk about it a lot. It's inevitable. And so the other thing that you have, most new churches somewhere in the first 3 years go through a crisis. We went through ours last year, had a major staff crisis. And you want the wisdom of people who've served as elders elsewhere in the past. That ends up being an important thing to take you through that. When we would see, when I worked with the Orchard Group, it wasn't uncommon for me to chair the board of a very rapidly growing new church for even 10 years as an external person. And that was because super rapidly growing churches usually had extremely charismatic lead pastors who also would shoot themselves in the foot pretty regularly. And so you needed a strong chair to just stop that from happening.
Well, let's move on to some closing questions. I appreciate you. I've been just kind of peppering you with questions, and I appreciate your response here. So you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're a pope for a day, what would that day look like?
I would ex cathedra make the pronouncement that clergy could marry worldwide. Because I believe that is the genesis of the Catholic sex abuse issue. And I think if you allowed the clergy to marry, you would see very positive things happen worldwide in the Catholic Church.
Good. A theologian or historical Christian figure you would want to meet or bring back to life?
Teilhard de Chardin. was seen as a scoundrel and a heretic by the Catholic Church, and kicked out, and now is a saint in
Yeah.
liberal Catholic circles.
Yeah.
Just a, wise, brilliant philosopher, theologian, who I wish I could remember his quote. I'm using it in the end of a chapter in my book, that man will come to realize that nothing matters except love. And once we come to realize that, for the second time ever, man will have discovered fire.
Great. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think it's possible that what history is going to remember is the loss of democracy in the West. I hope that's not true, but I'm afraid it might be true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll ask this question, perhaps a more hopeful question. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
We will always be a religious species because, like I said early on, it was the need to it's man's search for meaning that brought us together in the first place. And I think Jesus' instruction on his last day of public ministry, the last public question he ever
Rena,
answered,
can you please keep him out of
22nd
here?
chapter of Matthew, which of the laws is the greatest? And he said, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. And there was dead silence because they were stunned that he said something so simple. And he said, that's it. That is, in fact, in the final analysis, what it's about: loving God, loving neighbor, loving self. And I believe that if we can do that better and better, we can change the world.
That'd be a good start. Well, thanks so much for your time. Where can people find out more about you?
PaulaStoneWilliams.com.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for your time, and may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Lauren. Good being with you.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.